My name is Yeshua Moser-Puangsuwan. I'm part of Nonviolence International Canada. We've set up a section of it there. And my day job is I work for the International Campaign to Ban Landmines and the Cluster Munitions Coalition. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning. Good morning.
Why are you here? Why are you doing this internship?
To help others the best way I can.
How do you think you'll do it through here?
By using my little set of skills to assist something that's bigger than me.
That's noble. Thank you. Anybody else? Yeah.
I want to deepen my knowledge on peace and conflict issues, and I'm doing that through doing research and writing blogs.
Good. Excellent. We don't get a lot of that in our ordinary educational system. We don't get nearly enough.
To help people. Recently there was a girl who was again, and I've seen how Josh and the team were directly working to help with
The one in Israel?
Yes.
Yes.
So that is a very great opportunity to help someone, to actually help people, to be actively involved in solving people's problems. That is why
I walked here from the metro train line on Harlem Street. I saw a lot of people there who needed help.
that's true. Step by step, we are getting involved directly and indirectly. We are making our little contribution. We cannot change the whole world at once, but with our little contribution here, I think we are going to make a very good impact.
That's quite noble. You won't make much money doing that.
But then
Everyone laughed very quickly. Too quickly. That was frightening.
excessive wealth is usually from doing good, but material gains are not always everything. But then if you make it the world a better place, I would like to believe that the more wealthiness.
Yeah, money cannot buy happiness, but it can buy several things we need to survive.
I think our involvement through the United Nations is important because that's trying to be involved at the international level, and that's also important as well as the local level and national level.
Well, I'm sitting here talking to you today. You've been ordered to be here. What would you like to know about the person who's sitting in front of you?
What qualifies you to be our expert?
Maybe the way I've chosen to live my life. Now, I was born in this country. I don't live here anymore, but I was born here. And I was born here a long time ago. And at that time, this country wanted to send me to a war in Indochina. If you were a young man in the United States at that point in time, there was a conscription system that required you to go. It had life and death decision making over you. And so at that time, a lot of young men, myself included, had to reflect upon our feelings about committing violence to other human beings. Some people, like myself, said we were conscientious objectors to the use of violence to resolve human problems and would refuse to do military service, for which we received some amount of social condemnation, and we risked potentially being sent to prison. And so it caused me to reflect upon things at a young age. And I've kept those views most of my life, focusing on trying to find nonviolent ways of resolving human problems. In 1990, I was the Southeast Asia regional representative of the organization. I opened an office there, ran it for 15 years, worked with people's movements in that area to find usually methods of opposing inappropriate development projects. And by that I mean projects where the cost would fall on usually a poorer section of society and the benefits accrue to a wealthy, usually urban-based elite. Prior to that, I had worked on many programs for social change in this country before I decided to leave it permanently. Because when I turned 50, which was many years ago, I was saying, okay, well, I've managed to survive. And I looked to see what types of social care, health care, and retirement were given to social activists in this country, and I found it wanting. So I moved to a country that provided that. That's a very capsule history of my life. Ask more questions.
What is your main focus in your activism?
Currently, I produce an annual report for the International Campaign to Ban Landmines, which received the Nobel Prize in 1997 for its work to end the suffering caused by anti-personnel landmines, and for the Cluster Munition Coalition. Both of these are very large civil society networks with sections in many countries that are seeking to ban worldwide anti-personnel landmines and cluster munitions as threats to human societies. We have a monitoring project. I hire researchers around the world to work underneath me on that project, gathering the data that we need to firmly establish the norm of non-use and non-possession of these weapons. And I edit it into our final annual reports, and I use that factual information to lobby governments to make sure they're doing the right thing. And that's one of the things that I'm doing at the first committee meetings here this week.
Do you see disarmament as one of the most important issues in the world?
No.
What do you see as the most important issues?
Whatever's important to any individual. Yeah, everyone has to discover that battle for themselves. We are all unique human lives, and we all have different experiences that will lead us to probably respond to some type of injustice more strongly if we really listen to our hearts, which everyone should do, and move down that track of trying to resolve that injustice, because if we don't do it, something inside of us dies. Every human being has compassion in our heart, and the capitalist system will do the best that it can to eradicate that from you, and that will eradicate part of your humanity. So really keeping that alive by responding to it is the most important thing an individual can do, in my opinion.
What do you see as the most important?
That was your last question, Dick. There are a whole lot of other people that are.
I have a question. I believe you said for International Day of Nonviolence that nonviolence should be a norm. How do you think that us as a society we can reach nonviolence as a norm?
Well, actually, I would say nonviolence is the norm. I mean, when we go down to the coffee shop here on the corner, a person doesn't bang on the counter and says, "Give me a cup of coffee or else." That just doesn't happen, you know? And thankfully it doesn't happen. Nonviolence is the norm in human behaviors. We've all been very kind to one another in the room. You gave me a cup of coffee. We've been polite. We've said hello. Nobody has threatened to beat up anybody else in this room. Nonviolence is the norm in human society. But we do have violence in human society. There's no question about it. And that comes from differences that we have in human society, difference about the way we see about doing things and so forth and so on. And how do we address those differences without getting someone to the point where they feel that violence is the only thing that they have because they're striking out at what's undesired in the environment with so much energy.
Do you think that violence rates and methods have been increased or decreased over this decade?
Do I think violence is on the increase?
Violent methods and rate have been increased or decreased through this last year?
You know, it's really difficult to know. As far as I know, there's no global measure on this. There are a variety of global measures out there, like the use of armed conflict, which they measure is decreasing. Perception and actuality are very different. For years, Americans felt that crime was increasing when it was actually decreasing. And that was, so perception of violence and the actuality are also different. And when our awareness expands, something may appear to be increasing when we are simply becoming more aware of it. But I don't know of any global measures on that. There are kind of like specific measures on like specific forms of violence like burglary and whatever, but I don't know of any global measures on that, and it's never occurred to me as a question. Any amount of violence in our world is too much as far as I'm concerned, and it's something that we always need to pay attention to and think about if we don't want it to increase, because violence has a nature of increasing. Once a situation becomes violent, it becomes difficult for parties to step back and stand down. Violence has an escalatory nature to it, so we always have to interrupt and contradict that escalation as quickly and soon as possible.
What are the tactics for advocacy that you've used, and like what have you found works better? When
There's no one size fits all, so it would all depend on the issue. In some cases, I've used nonviolent civil disobedience tactics. One of the things that caused me to decide to leave the United States as a resident was that I just got tired of going to jail. I got tired of going to jail because I was constantly involved in civil disobedience because I didn't feel that some things were right in my environment and I had to make a stand against them. And it was one of the loudest stands that I could take. I gained extremely short-term notoriety abroad because I lived in Bangkok for several years, and every time the U.S. started a war, I would go stand in front of the U.S. Embassy and block the entrance. And I would get arrested for that because if there was a thing that said American citizen is arrested, it's a strong message into the central government. And because of the way the sun comes up and news media works, I would be the first American arrested at an American installation anywhere on the planet. So I gained this little short-term notoriety. And the response by the U.S. embassies at that time was extraordinary. During the 1991 Gulf War, they stationed people with M16s across the street from me, and I heard them talking on their radio saying, this person with the sign is just a front, the real attack is coming from somewhere else. I mean, they were over the top excited about my little demonstration in front of their gate. Another time, the person came out from the embassy and said, please don't block our gate. And I said, hey, I've got a lot of other things I'd really prefer to be doing today, so why don't you just not go to war and I'll be gone? And he said, you've been warned. Went inside and the police removed me. So sometimes standing in front of is an appropriate tactic, if only for your own humanity. But then in the case of the UN, I'm mostly using diplomatic measures of talking to people. Sometimes I find ways to crack through is using humor. The North Koreans and the US were going at it in the room for quite a while. They used the right of reply to dump venom on each other in the room in the least diplomatic measure. And it's very difficult to get through to the North Koreans because of their training and so forth and so on. And so after a heated exchange between the North Koreans and the US, I went and sat behind the North Korean delegate and I said to him, you've got a really tough job. And I got a smile out of him, and then I could start engaging with him. And otherwise he was just hostile. So you always have to look into the situation, use your intuition, use your creativity, use everything that you don't want to use in a violent situation, because violence just wants to make it shut down. And it's willing to open yourself to that, a little bit of vulnerability to allow you to find the creative response. Sometimes you won't. Yeah.
How do you deal with like getting discouraged? Like sometimes the world seems like nothing's happening, nothing's changing, everyone sucks. How do you deal with like you can still?
I love that question. Do something about it. You'll feel better. The situation might not change, but you'll feel better. I mean, despair, most people feel disempowered. They feel like there's nothing they can do about it, the situation is bigger than them, and if you do something about it, the situation may change for the better. Probably won't change for the worse. If you don't do something about it, you're going to feel worse. So action is the antidote to despair. I mean, nonviolence is not always going to be successful. Violence usually leads to failure, but nonviolence is not always going to be successful. If there was any method that guaranteed success, we'd all be using it all the time. You know, there is no method that guarantees you success. Nonviolence is an ethical choice.
Do you have your own role model? And if so,
Oh, many. I've got many. All of the people, of course, who greatly inspire individuals. I've been lucky. I'm older than you, so I've got a lot of life experience that I've got in the bank, and I've managed to meet some of the great people that are around that we should have respect for. I've visited the Dalai Lama at his residence a few times. He is a person whom a lot of people respect, and he is the real deal. He is the genuine article. Everyone should respect this individual. He's got so much integrity. And being able to meet people like that is always uplifting. There are a number of other Nobel Peace laureates like Wangari Maathai and others that I've had an ability to meet in my work. Wangari's gone now, but most of the Nobel Peace laureates, not 100% of them, that's a political prize, but many of those people are people who are noble. They're noble, they're wise, they're inspiring, they're uplifting, they walk the talk. And so try to meet those people in your work, and one of the guaranteed tickets for that is your own commitment. Because that will put you in the orbit of these people. And of course, the Indian struggle is one that's been a model for nonviolent activists for decades. I've spent quite a bit of time in India. I did my doctorate in peace research in India at the university which was founded by Mahatma Gandhi in 1920. So I met a number of the people who were actually involved in the independence struggle during that time, and I talked to them about what their life was like, and I learned from them. But here, there are still people who are around from the civil rights struggle. These are people who you can find in the community. You should attempt to do so. Their commitment will be inspiring. It'll uplift you. It's fuel.
I have a question. Besides nonviolent actions, there are also nonviolent communications. Could you give us your input or your idea or definition maybe of what nonviolent communication is? And do you think it can be taught, for example, in school to children? And that would help,
Yeah, that's a very good question. One of the things I've been reflecting on recently is the amount of hatred that can spread on social media. Obviously an unskillful use of the tool. Social media is really what I hate military metaphors. Military likes to call a force multiplier. It expands the power of an individual, in our case. And I don't think anyone should ever say on social media anything they wouldn't say to a person who's right in front of them. Because social media gives the illusion of distance, right? You're sitting in a room by yourself, hammering out on the keyboards, and you may get a little bit of short-term satisfaction by the flames, but the damage you can do so quickly amongst a number of people is extraordinary. And I think the reflection on consequences is probably the main thing around nonviolent communication that needs to be emphasized. There are consequences to our actions, there's consequences to our words. But I do think a lot more needs to be done there. There are a lot of people who are working on that area of nonviolent communication, and that's not an area that I can put much time into myself. The Alternative to Violence Project, Quakers Run, and others are focusing on that. Reflective listening. Listening is always a good idea. And I think that we could use more teaching in why that's an important element of communication in our educational system.
Suggesting that you are very, very experienced in the area of nonviolent disarmament and advocating for, disarmament in the world. You will be in this industry for a while now. One of the most prevailing problems in Namibia currently is, gender-based violence as a result of men who shoot the wife and then shoot themselves. It is a very increasing problem in Namibia. How were you able to deal with such a problem throughout the years that you've been involved in this area of disarmament? Or how do you advocate for a younger nation to work on reducing the access to weapons?
Well, Namibia is not in a unique situation there. Male on female violence is an epidemic worldwide. And an interesting element of that there is the suicide after the violence, because it shows the understanding in the human heart of why that is wrong. A person can't live with the action that they've done. And we see it so common. Male violence where the man will kill a woman or even their entire family and then commit suicide afterwards because they can't live with the consequences. Gender-based violence is not the area where I focus a lot of my work, but a lot of work is going on there. And I'm trying to think of the best places to push you to in that. Some of my colleagues in the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom really do focus on that strongly. They've been putting out a lot of materials. And that is one place to look for that. There are a lot of organizations focused on that in every country because it's a socially acceptable place to deal with violence. Not state violence, that's not acceptable. But dealing with interpersonal violence is considered to be a separate problem. I don't really think it is. If the highest authorities can use violence, why can't an individual use it? It's the wrong teaching. But there are more organizations working. I haven't put a lot of time on that specific area.
So you mentioned that you lived abroad. Do you think that it's easier to advocate nonviolence abroad rather than here at home, especially since Americans we pride ourselves in our military?
Nope. It's difficult anywhere. There are unique problems in every country. You're all very aware of the unique problems there. So it just manifests differently.
As an activist, like some people think that the UN in a way upholds some of like the hierarchies and systems that have led to like conflicts in different countries. How do you manage like around those kind of issues in order to make the world change?
That view is accurate. The United Nations is essentially a club of states. And it has at its heart state interests, which are not the interests of human beings. I spend as little of my time in that building as possible. But it does have a certain amount of power. And so recognizing what it can and cannot do, what you can and cannot do there, is important for working in that environment. I would agree with that view. And so there are limitations to what you can do there. There are some things you can't do there, but some things you can't. And to a great degree, it reflects the problems that are in human societies because it is a club of states.
What are some of the things that you can do as an individual?
Naming and shaming is one of them, because they have a tendency they have a tendency to hide there. You've probably all heard of the United Nations Human Rights Council. And 20 years ago, I was on my first trip to Geneva. I was visiting a friend who was working in the Commission on Human Rights, the Palais Wilson, and I was outside the building. I had just met him, was going to go inside. I was kind of starry-eyed. Here's, the home of human rights. And I said, what happens in this building? And he said, this is where the crimes of states are covered up. And what was your question again? Somehow this was a story responding to that.
What are some of the things you can do at the UN as
in each one of these structures, even though structurally there are great limitations, there are human beings working inside, and some of them can do things, and those are our allies. There are a certain number of people that are sitting there, they're career ladder climbers, they're not going to rock the boat, they're going to do nothing outside of that framework. There are a number of people in there who joined it because they want to do the right thing. And they're our allies, and they can help us do things with the power that's within that system. So working with those people is one of the ways to move things forward. But I met 2 years ago the UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial executions and arbitrary killings. He was at the top of the chain. He's an international lawyer. He was appointed to that position. And when I walked into the room with him, he said, thank you for your work. If it wasn't for the work that you do in civil society, there would be no human rights. So it is really the power of individuals to hold the powerful to account that brings about human rights and brings about any success by nonviolent means in social struggles. So it's working with allies to do that and finding those allies.
So, what is the role of civil society at the United Nations?
To be civil and to hold the powerful to account. Because we are outsiders. They don't want us there. They don't want us there.
So you said that there's things that are better used outside. So you just went over some of the things that we should do in the UN, but for the cause, what are the things that would be better outside of the UN?
Well, on every social issue we have, whether it's labor issues, the environment, human rights of various kinds, child's rights, in whatever field we are, finding out where are the power levers in our society, where can we make a difference, where can we begin to bring about change that meets human needs, that uplifts human beings, and doing those things. And as a result of doing those things, we will identify what are those power levers that we need to move in each one of those issues, however it manifests in our own unique countries, whether we are in Namibia or Thailand or wherever we are. I mean, there's not a one-size-fits-all answer to that. That's about as close as you can
What do you believe the end goal for you is? What if you can actually see?
get. I think it's crematorium.
Well,
Might be a graveyard for you.
with peace. With peace around the world, what would you say, like, is when you see it? I don't know. What's your view on that? It's jumping over your question because of that.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly changed for me over the years. In the international campaign to ban landmines, one of the things that the activists within the movement have said is, we will achieve this within our lifetime. We will achieve it within our lifetime. And we've got 80% of the world's governments on board. We've seen a decline in the number of victims to landmines every year. It is a success in progress. We've removed mines from the grounds of countries around the planet, and that's been turned over to productive and safe human use in urban and rural societies around the planet. And so we have measurable success indicators, and we can say, this is the resolution to this problem. We know what it is. We've got a small hardcore of states that are still outside of it, but by and large, we are being successful. We want to be 100% successful before the end of our lives, because it's a beautiful thing to pass on. There are a lot of human problems. We've identified one, we resolved it. And showing that we can do that is extremely important. There have been a lot of other side effects of that specific movement. They're very, very important and less visible. But that being successful, I think, is the most important thing we can do there. In my own life, certainly staying human, not giving into violence, is going to be the success measure that I have set for myself. I'm relatively confident that I will achieve it. I wouldn't have been when I was your age.
Why, how did you get involved with Nonviolence International, or why Nonviolence International specifically?
Well, it was quite a long time ago, and I had met Mubarak Awad, the founder, and saw that what he wanted to achieve fit very well with my activities at that time, so I asked if I could set up an office in Southeast Asia, because I had just finished a term of service with a human rights organization in Sri Lanka, and had gone to work for a local Thai non-governmental organization working on a peace project there. And when I was done with it, I was looking for something else to do. And so I asked them if I could open an office there, because I felt that the ideal of expanding the knowledge and use of nonviolent methods of resolving human problems was precisely what I wanted to do. So that's when I chose to open that office, which came with a sanction and no money, which will be the norm that you'll experience. I built a section of the organization there, an office, a staff, which I was responsible for, and did a lot of projects that I felt very good about. I feel many of them were innovative. So I really enjoyed that. I now live half the time in Western Canada, and I established a branch of Nonviolence International, which is a Canadian federal nonprofit organization there. We haven't done a lot. There's only a few of us, and we all work on it voluntarily on available time, which is minimal.
How do you see the human rights situation in Southeast Asia?
It's different in each country, and it changes all the time. In some ways, they can be very progressive, and in other ways, very regressive.
Can you name some countries?
Thailand and Malaysia, I would say, are probably the most progressive within the region. I mean, Thailand right now has a military regime, but they were one of the first countries to sign the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So it's a very unusual situation. Malaysia has just had an election that looks to be much more progressive, looks like they've just abolished the death penalty. I was talking to the Malaysian ambassador, and he's very optimistic about the future political circumstances in the country, and I find that I am as well. You take a country like Burma, which is a human rights basket case, and everything is going in the wrong direction, and be very happy you don't live there. I spend too much of my time there, and it's very distressing. It's very distressing.
All these words that you had plus one comment from Burma, and see all the time tells us the terrible stories that you experience.
Yeah, and they're probably 10 times worse than the stories you hear. It's really, it's a place of human despair.
So, since you were working in Southeast Asia and now you're in Canada, has your work evolved? Has it changed, or do you still focus on the same?
Well, it's changed because I was working for Nonviolence International full-time for 15 years. Now I've moved to a disarmament movement, which I work for basically half-time. And on my other half of my time, I pursue a whole number of projects, which can be consultancies for different organizations, and it depends. At this point in my life, I get approached to do a lot of things, and I sit on a lot of boards and this type of thing, but I also get approached for projects, and I have to pick and choose which I can spend time on, and what I think I can make the most contribution to a better world through, or they just interest me. So it's a nice position to be in. So it's changed probably due to my age more than anything else. Because now I'm in a position where I can actually pick and choose some of the things that I want to be involved in, which is really, really a nice place to be. I'm lucky.
How have you seen the work civil society is doing progress over the years?
I would say that civil society work is expanding around the world. There has been a certain increase in resources and mobility globally. And it's allowed more people to manifest and have the ability to manifest their compassion and their concern than ever before. Some of it is technological. A lot of technological tools, while they have increased our ability to do harm at a faster rate, they've also increased our ability to do good at a greater capacity. And so some of that is technological, our ability to communicate with one another. The International Campaign to Ban Landmines was founded at the outbreak of email, and it allowed us to organize globally in a way that no movement before us had ever been able to do. So the ability of people to reach across borders or to do more work within their own borders has expanded, and you can see the results of that with the growth of civil society around the planet and the growth of people working on issues. So if people have been empowered by changing circumstances within their own countries as well as technology. Maybe one over here, who they've been very, very quiet.
This is something that I've asked before to Dan, who was speaking about nonviolence, and I think that you might have touched on it before, but what do you do when you really come across barriers with people who don't want to hear the things that you have to say or work towards these peaceful changes?
That's a really good question, because we run across a lot of those people in our lives every day, don't we? I think, and I'm sure you just do this, there's a cost-benefit analysis. Is this person worth wasting the time on? You know? I'm staying with some friends in White Plains, and they had a relative who was over, and that person voiced from something I said an opinion that was both totally wrong and uninformed from my point of view. And I just thought about it for a moment. Well, they are really strongly in that position. I'll never see this person again. They're a relative of a person who I'm a guest in their house. I just didn't say anything more. You know, you do the cost-benefit analysis. Now, if it's a person who's on the other side of a struggle that I'm highly invested in, my response is going to be very different. And I'm going to be looking at the way to find a way through. And one example is I had to reach across to the North Korean delegate, you know, so I was looking for the way. I was sitting there for hours trying to figure out what to do, and suddenly it came to me. There was an Iranian delegate I've been really trying to get through for our movement to Iran. And each time I talked to him, he would just vent about how frustrated he was in his position. And the first two times I couldn't get a meeting with him. He just vented frustration. And that was a good time to practice my reflective listening skills, right? But I had to get through to him, so I kept going back to him. And finally I just said in exasperation, hey, you know, I get it, what your position is, but you need friends. I've been trying to reach out to you. Why don't you talk to me? And that was what did it. He was then, okay, I will sit down with you and talk to you. And we had a good conversation at that. We could talk about issues, and he stopped venting. Every circumstance is going to be different. Again, there's no one size fits all. You're going to have to trust your intuition. You have to be fairly strong in yourself. You have to know your own place on it. If you're feeling weak, it's probably not a good thing to do. Probably you should pull back and think about where am I in this situation, and what's my part in this problem, and what am I doing about that? Know where you sit to start off with. Is any of that helpful?
Yeah.
Okay, David.
Many people see disarmament as like a necessary but short-term solution to conflict, to violent conflict. And so what are really important long-term solutions to violent conflict? And how do you see, is education one of them, or how do you see education fitting into that?
Okay, well, let's suggest that let's imagine for the moment that I go to the UN tomorrow, maybe even this afternoon, and say, I would like to talk about all nations getting rid of all weapons and transferring all that money to meeting human needs. What would be the response?
They'd stop listening.
Stop this. Impossible?
They would say no.
Huh?
They
No?
would say no.
Okay. Now, what if the president, maybe not the current one, of the United States said the same thing at the United Nations?
God.
Well, let's say it happened. Then what?
I think some would agree.
Some would agree.
Some would be more open and ask how, and it would open a discussion.
Okay. Well, the U.S. president did send a proposal to the United Nations that all nations should get rid of their entire military forces. That it sent it through the Secretary of State to the United Nations that all nations should get rid of their military forces and should transfer that spending to meeting human needs. Another member of the Security Council, it was Russia in this case, said we agree with that proposal, but we should get rid of all speech that brings us to places in which people would engage in armed conflict. We should get rid of all pro-war speech, as well as get rid of all military expenditures and transferring it to human needs. If you want to see the U.S. proposal, go online, look for Freedom from War. This is the U.S. proposal. It is in the United Nations now, and it is called General and Complete Disarmament. They will be discussing it this afternoon at the UN building in the first committee. This is non-controversial. It's been in the United Nations for years. It's called the track General and Complete Disarmament. That's what the words mean. General and Complete Disarmament. It was proposed in 1962. And this is non-controversial. Now, if that's the case, how did we get to the situation where we are now? How many countries do you think have actually reached that goal? 20. How many in the Americas have reached that goal?
At least one. Costa Rica, right?
3 or 4. I'd have to check the list. How many NATO members have reached that goal? 1. Iceland. It has no military forces. Yet it's in NATO. Isn't that weird? I could go on down this line for a while, but there is a track in the United Nations which is General and Complete Disarmament, disbandment of all military forces, and moving that wasted expenditure to meeting human needs. It's actually there. How many people know that? So this gets to your question about disarmament education. This is the goal. This is not controversial. This is not controversial. It might be controversial in the US today, but how much of us understand the history? Now, this wasn't all of your question. There was something more in there.
What are other long-term goals and priorities in addition to disarmament, like as a first step? Then what are the long-term goals and priorities and tactics to reach world peace?
The main shift that we need to make right now is a shift from looking at national defense to global defense. I've been doing a study of military white papers, which is in theory the rationale for the acquisition of weapons by military forces. You all know what military white papers are? It's like a defense policy doctrine put out by a military. And most of them have identified threats to their country, such as terrorism, informal migration, economic uncertainty, environmental instability. How many of these can you fight with a tank? The threats are real, but none of them stop at a border. The idea of a standing national military force is an anachronism from another century. We've got to move beyond it if we're going to survive.
What about threat from neighbors? I mean, that's still always a possibility that a country will develop a despot or a crazed person.
I know in Canada we're really worried about that.
Yeah. Yeah, really. So isn't that a reason to have tanks?
No, if we had as many tanks as we could possibly afford in Canada, it would do no good. I mean, really, it's an interesting discussion because it's an interesting mentality. I remember sitting down with a delegate of China, talking to them about getting rid of landmines. And he said, well, you know, we need landmines for our defense. And whenever a country says that, it's kind of like permission for everybody to stop thinking. You know, you don't talk about it any further, you stop thinking, you go on to the next topic. And I looked at him and I said, who the hell's gonna invade you? You're China. And he was dumbfounded. He was dumbfounded because nobody ever asked him that question before. And it was interesting because then we were able to drop down to talking about issues within the party, the structure of the People's Liberation Army, and a whole lot of other real issues. Because I didn't stop it, I didn't shut off my mind like I was supposed to when he said defense. And if you look at the reality of it, there's very little to be worried about in today's world. I mean, if you want to worry about it, the United States can't even hold that tiny little country of Afghanistan. You know? It can't. I mean, this is just not a rational fear, for the most part. So that has to be challenged. That whole mindset has to be challenged. It's an anachronism. Okay, well, we're at the witching hour. I have to leave, go on and harass other people. So I hope that this morning has been helpful for you, at least maybe been entertained. And I salute your internship here. You could be interning at some brand of cosmetics, but you're here. And I think that that speaks to the fact that you want to do something noble and worthwhile in your society. And I would like to encourage you to hold on to that, because the world is going to try and beat that out of you. Hold on to that and do something good.